You have to watch Charles. You never know what he's going to do.
Keep your guessing.
We're glad you're all here today. We're glad that we have folks that have been sick that are here, and we hope that means you're feeling better. We've got people that have been traveling, and we're glad that you're back. Bishop, we're glad you're back. Say you got Rocky Mountain High, huh?
That's right.
Good, Bishop. Ben, glad you're back. Jen, glad you're back with him. Glad Mr. and Mrs. Kilbride are back from their travels. You've got a child that's 50 years old. Good heavens, that's your baby. Yeah, I thought Boyd was your baby. Yeah. I started to say in response to a question a while ago that I don't look a day over 71, but I look exactly a day over 71. Good Lord, I can remember when that seemed old as a hill. I mean, that was 1 foot in the grave age. Doesn't seem so old anymore. You know, I was thinking this week, and I don't know if nobody's soliciting this, but I think that sometimes we forget. We spend all this time talking about the inner city ministry in Camp Lookout, and Dave brings that to our attention, and our class supports that in a really wonderful way. I think that we ought to remind ourselves from time to time that Nina got all that started, and that is such a big deal to have that kind of legacy following you around. So Nina, we don't take lightly the fact that all this talk that we have about the inner city and the Camp Lookout wouldn't have been possible had it not been for your early work and all that. So we appreciate that. Y'all ready for River Bend? Well, good. I've got a section of scripture I'd like to fool around with for a few weeks, maybe 3. I don't think we can talk about it all in 1 week. I'm trying to get finished after about 2 years a book on the parables. And this one I keep pushing back because this one really has so much in it that's surprising and unusual that I try to come to grips with. So I'm going to try to do that, and maybe by the time the summer's over I'll be through with all the parables. This one's kind of one that we've heard a million times, but I think that maybe it kind of gets overlooked a little bit. It'll take a moment to read it, but let me read it and then you can read it over the next 2 or 3 weeks some. There was a rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, full of sores, who desired to be fed with what fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, the dogs came and licked his sores. The poor man died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died and was buried, and in Hades, being in torment, he lifted up his eyes, and he saw Abraham far off and Lazarus in his bosom. And he called out, Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in anguish in this flame. But Abraham said, Son, remember that you in your lifetime received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner evil things, but now he is comforted here, and you are in anguish. And besides all this, between us and you is a great chasm that has been fixed, in order that those who would pass from here to you may not be able, and more may cross from there to us. None may cross from there to us. And the rich man said, Then I beg you, Father Abraham, to send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, so that he may warn them, lest they may come into this place of torment. But Abraham said, They have Moses and the prophets, let them hear them. Now the rich man said, No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent. Abraham said to him, If they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone should be raised from the dead. That's an interesting little story. Let's see if we can figure out what's going on. First of all, I think that in this section of Luke, that you kind of have something of the second Sermon on the Mount. We know that the first Sermon on the Mount was a collection of things that Jesus said early in his ministry. I think that what we have here in this part of Luke is a collection of things that Jesus said late in his ministry, after he'd been out there 3 years living and preaching. I think that if you look at the Sermon on the Mount, that you see Jesus primarily relating to common people. People that were his first followers and people that were like his first disciples. People from the earth and people that were laborers and people that were workers and people that did things like go fishing to earn their living. But by the time that you come down to the end of Jesus' ministry, he has attracted the attention of a very different group of people. He's attracted the attention of the well-to-do, of the rich, of the powerful, of the people that make a great deal of difference in that society. He has moved from kind of the common man to the upper crust, and he has moved from the outbacks of Palestine, where he first preached, to the very center of Jerusalem, where he's preaching now. And so he's come in contact with a group of different people, and at the end of the Gospels we see him interacting with these people all of the time. I think that there's one common element that goes from the beginning to the end. I think that in the beginning, with those common folk, that Jesus was trying to help them. He was trying to assure them that they were loved by God, they were cared about by God, that they were important to God, that they had value before God. He was trying to tell them that before God that they were as good and as welcome as anybody. By the time he gets to the end of his ministry, although it's with a great conflict from this upper crust, I think he's still trying to help them. I think he's still trying to convey that there's a chance and opportunity for them within the mercy of God, that there's still a way that they can be a part of God's kingdom. And so I think early on we see Jesus trying to help the common man, and I think that later on at the end he's trying to help these people, sometimes people that were very, very hateful to him and very, very unwelcoming to him. It shows us how much Jesus was capable of loving. Now, from that perspective, I think that we find in this particular parable a lot that is very, very obvious to us, and maybe that's why we read across it so quickly. We find that there's a rich man. And if you look at the Greek language that describes him, we can see how rich he is. We can see that in the clothing that he wears. The language in the Greek that talks about his purple clothing and his fine linens is exactly the same kind of language that you would use if you were describing the most special clothing, the most special robes, the most special coverings of the Jewish priests in the temple and the synagogue on their very, very most special days when they brought out the very best. At the highest feast, at the highest festivals, at the moments in which they had their most worshipful celebrations and ceremonies. But this rich man dresses like this every day. It also says about this rich man that he dined sumptuously every day. And so it was not like he was having an occasional banquet, or it was not like he was having an occasional feast, or maybe like the priest participating in a random kind of ceremony. He did this every day. And so when you had that kind of status, it wasn't just you that was sitting down in the corner and having a nice meal. It was probably you surrounded by 50 to 100 of your people that were being feeded and fed in the most wonderful ways that were imaginable. And so in the language that Jesus uses in this parable, he's describing to us somebody who is really, really, really well-to-do. And then Jesus describes to us Lazarus, the poor man. And the Greek language that's important there is the word balo. And it's a word that describes the way that this man, that is Lazarus, ends up at this man's gate or at his steps to his very fine home, I'm sure. Balo can mean thrown, like you would throw a ball. And so it could very well be that what Jesus is saying is that here was a human being that was just kind of thrown out of society. Here was a human being that did so little that he could just kind of be thrown out onto the steps of the rich man. That word can also mean placed or put in a specific way. And so it may very well be that he had some friends somewhere, or he had family, or he had people that cared about him, that took him with maybe some degree of affection and placed him, put him right there at the steps of the rich man, so he would almost have to stumble over him, and his guest would almost have to stumble over him as they came and went to their festivals in their fine clothes. I don't know which is the answer in the parable at that point. It probably doesn't make much difference, because there's huge cleavage between the rich man and the poor man, and the rich man has everything that his heart might desire, and the poor man has nothing. And so how he got there really is of no significance. The fact is, he is there, and Jesus is trying to point out that there is some need for this man to be helped. As it turns out, the rich man sins. And it's very interesting to understand that sin. He doesn't come out and curse the poor man and run him off, and so he doesn't try to come down on him in some kind of a hard way. He doesn't call the temple police that undoubtedly would have been at his disposal and tell them to come and scurry this man out of the way and not have him come back. He doesn't kick the man as he passes. In fact, for some reason or other, he knows the man's name, and he refers to him in the parable as Lazarus. He knows this man. And so his sin is not a sin of hurting the man or doing something evil or damaging to the man. His sin is a sin of omission. He has the capacity to help the man. He has the capacity to do him some good. And he is simply indifferent to him. He's somebody that life has just kind of thrown up on the shore of his life. I worry about that sometimes. I worry sometimes that we're not mean people. We're not people that tend to be hurtful in our interactions with other people. We're not people that are kind of calling the police and telling them to get the panhandlers off the street and put them in jail. That's kind of not our nature. But I wonder sometimes if it's not true that there are people of all kinds of needs that get thrown up on the shores of our lives. And we kind of come and go, and we don't hurt them, and we don't yell at them, and we don't do anything bad to them. But maybe we are indifferent, and we pass by. And having the ability to help, maybe we don't. And I think that's what Jesus is saying in his parable. He's saying, sure, there is wrong and there is evil and hurting people. And that happens sometimes and should be corrected. But maybe there's harm and indifference, and that we ought to be more concerned about that and celebrating the fact that we haven't hurt anybody lately. The story seems very conventional at this point. It seems like that Jesus is suddenly this emissary of a new set of values. That Jesus is the one who's come with the good news, and that Jesus is the one who's come to kind of take the values of people like this rich man and stand them on their head and kind of show a new way. And sometimes we portray Jesus as kind of a values revolutionary. who's come to kind of show a better way for people to live and a better way for people to be with each other. And so it would be very easy to take this parable and say, Jesus is trying to say now to this new crowd that's coming out to listen to him, you need to do something different. You need to do something better. You need to have transformation in your lives. You need to go and help these poor people. And Jesus becomes the new messenger of a new message. I've thought about Jesus a lot like that, to tell you the truth. I've thought about Jesus as the great teacher, and the great teacher of a new set of values, that if people would begin to live by them, that life would be revolutionized and the world would be a better place. And so I kind of have an image of Jesus marching down the street with a message, a new message that needs to be heard. But you know, that's not really accurate. And that image of Jesus as being this bearer of a new value system of love may not have been anything new at all. So for example, at Nazareth, when Jesus comes out, in the first words describing his mission and ministry, Jesus says, I've come to preach good news to the poor. And so this whole issue of poor people being helped was right at the very beginning of Jesus. It wasn't anything new for him. In the book of Deuteronomy, Jesus had studied at Nazareth that Moses has said that when you have a festival, you should always include slaves, strangers, orphans, and widows. By the time that Jesus gets in Luke 14 to repeat that, Jesus says when you have luncheons and banquets, you need to invite the poor and the crippled and the blind. Jesus said to the rich young ruler in Luke 18, what's necessary for you to do is to take all that you have and distribute it to the poor. I love a little verse that you can find in Luke 12. It's an interesting little verse. Jesus says to his disciples, make purses for yourselves that don't wear out. Anybody remember that verse? Now, these were not strange men that were carrying purses. They didn't have pockets in their clothes very often in that world, so men carried purses. And so Jesus said, make purses that won't wear out. And why do you think he was saying that? He was saying maybe if you made a purse that didn't wear out, then you could take the money that you could spend on new purses every 5 minutes, and you might be able to give that to the poor. Now, I'm not trying to make anybody feel bad, and if you go into your closets and you've got 8,000 purses, good for you. That's not the point of what Jesus is trying to say exactly. I did think it was kind of unusual this past week that Kim and Kanye, do you know Kim and Kanye? Kim Kardashian and Kanye West bought for their little baby girl a $4,000 Louis Vuitton purse. What's a little baby girl going to do with a $4,000 purse? And so Jesus was saying all along, make purses for yourself that won't wear out, and maybe the money you'd spend on purses you can give to the poor. Now please don't anyone say that Steve wants us to go home and get rid of all of our purses. That wasn't the point of the lesson. In the book of Tobit, which probably we've not had a chance to read much, but if we were Jewish we would, it says, do not turn your face away from anyone who is poor. If you have many possessions, make your gift from them in proportion. If you do not be afraid to give from the little that you have. See, the point I'm trying to make is this. From the very moment that they were born and taken to the synagogue or the temple, from the very moment that they went to the synagogue school or the church school, from the very moment that they were old enough to hear words being spoken by rabbis and teachers, from the very moment that they could read these words for themselves as they came of age, the message had always been there. The message had always been there. That people of God share and help and are concerned and feel like that it is important to take from whatever they've got, a lot or a little, and to help those who are so easily found at the doorsteps of our lives who are poor. So you see, Jesus was not an innovator in his message at all. Jesus was not a revolutionary value theorist in his messages at all. Jesus simply had heard it from the time he was a little boy, and Jesus had understood it from the time he was old enough to understand. And somewhere along the line, Jesus had the epiphany, this is right. And so when he went out from John the Baptist in the Jordan River Valley to preach, and when he went out to teach, it was not that he went out with some kind of revolutionary new gospel. It was that he went out as a reinforcer of the truths that he had learned and the truths that had been available in his culture from the time that he was a little boy. He was simply out there articulating in the strongest way possible what had come to be truth and meaning and value in his life. And he heard it just like his brothers and sisters. He had heard it just like the kids that lived down the street. He had heard it just like generations of his people had heard it. And so the issue, and the parable is trying to make this very clear, is that people have heard the right stuff. They've heard it all the way from Moses and the prophets. They've heard exactly what they need to do. They just have chosen not to do it. There is a television show that's been on for 6 years called The Americans. I don't know if you've watched that or not. Sometimes it's a little rough. It's been the story about these two people that live in a suburb of Washington, D.C. in a very suburban house with 2 children that just happened to be Russian spies during the Cold War. And oh, the things they get into across 6 years of that program. But this has been the last season. And in this last season, you can tell that they're getting ready to get caught. And they are caught, or found out. But through a series of different events, they escape out of Washington, D.C. They make their way to the Canadian border. They are able to slip across the Canadian border. And finally, toward the end of the show, we see them on an airplane that is taking them back to Russia and back to Moscow. And then we see this couple standing in their homeland that they have given their lives in many ways for. And they're talking about what has brought them to this place and the price that they've paid. And the price that they've paid is profound. They don't get killed. That's what everybody was expecting. They don't get caught and put in prison. That's probably what people were expecting. But they lose their 2 children. One boy's in his last year of high school, and he's so Americanized they decide they shouldn't jerk him out of America and take him to Russia. The other, a girl halfway through college, decides that she's going to stay in America. And so she chooses not to go. So they lose their children. And so there they are, standing looking out over Moscow at night. And they're talking about what's brought their lives to this point. And one of them says to the other, "But we raised them, didn't we?" And they find hope in that. Because they feel like that the way that they've raised these two kids, one halfway through college, one ready to go to college, that they've given them enough substance and they've given them enough teaching and they've given them enough of the right examples. They didn't know they were really Russian spies for the most part. That they can carry on and live their lives in a successful and a good and maybe even an upright way. We have raised them. And boy, that captured my attention. And here's the way it captured my attention. I can tell you that I think that I'm a pretty good grandfather. I show up at baseball games and track meets and swim meets. And oh my Lord, if you show up at a swim meet, you're a pretty good grandparent. And we take them out to eat, and we buy them things for Christmas, and we have them come and spend the night with us. So I think, all things being equal, I'm a pretty good grandfather. I think that I'm a basically decent parent. I care about my adult children. I help them at times when they need help. I pray for them and the challenges that I know that are before them. And I try to be there for my two adult children. I think I'm a pretty decent parent. But you know what? There's one thing I absolutely know for sure. Across the first 16 or 18 years of their lives, my wife and I were great parents. I know that for sure. Because we worked with these kids and we taught these kids and we exposed these kids and we took them to places that should make a difference in their lives. They saw in us the right kind of role models. They saw us teaching and helping them to mature and to learn. I know that in the first 16 or 18 years, by golly, we did a good job. We raised them. But we all know, don't we, that when they get to be about 16 or 18, we've done about our biggest work. And now it's up to them. And it's within their range of responsibility and accountability to take what they've been given and decide if they're going to do something with it. To take how their hands have been held to a certain point and to let those hands go and go their own way. We raised them. I think that's what this Bible's saying. I think this Bible is saying in the words of Jesus that they had Moses and the laws. They had the prophets and the insights that the prophets bring about social judgment. I think that what this text is saying is that from the very, very beginning, people like the rich man or people like the common folks at the beginning of his ministry, they were raised right. They were told the right things. And now it's up to them to make the decisions to live it. Now this rich man stops us dead in our tracks, especially based on what we know is going to happen before this gospel's over. This rich man first says, "Oh, Father Abraham, just let Lazarus take a little cool water and come and touch it on my tongue. I'm burning up down here." Abraham says, "It's not going to happen." Then the rich man says, "Well, Father Abraham, let somebody come back from the dead, even old poor Lazarus, and let him go to my family and tell them about all this. And that'll cause them to reform their ways." And then at the end of the parable, Jesus has Abraham say, and get this, no, if they've not listened to Moses and the prophets, even if someone was raised from the dead, they wouldn't listen to him. Now, if that doesn't stop you in your tracks, I don't know what will. Because we know what's coming. Jesus is getting ready to pour his life out on that cross. And we know what's coming. Jesus is getting ready to be raised from the dead. We celebrate that every Easter, you know. But here Jesus is saying in his parable, even if somebody was raised from the dead, they wouldn't listen to him. We raised them right. This culture that Jesus himself was a part of raised them right. We told them the right things. This culture that Jesus was a part of told these people the right things. But will they choose to listen? Will they choose to respond? Will they choose to do what they know to do? Even if someone is raised from the dead, will they listen? Let's bow our heads in prayer. Help us, O God, that we might love those around us that we feel the most responsibility for in a way that we keep talking to. We keep showing them right ways. That we keep helping them debrief decisions in their lives and all the things that can make them better. But help us also to realize we probably had our chance for a while. And even if we did a very, very good job, that we've gotten them to the end of the runway, and now they take off and fly by their own choosing, by their own control. Help us to hear Jesus say that he was not bringing anything terribly new. He was simply reinforcing and calling people to what they already knew. So help us that we might ground ourselves in the truths that you've given us that we know so well. Help us to know that you have raised us right. And give us the strength and the grace and the courage to live by what we know. And to choose what we already know is best. For we ask in your Son's name. Amen. Okay, we'll come back and look at this some more next week. Thank you all for coming.